everybody. I have to raise this a little bit. This is my first NatCon. I want to thank Chris DeMuth and Yoram and David Goldman for encouraging me to come, but I didn't bring a speech, so I'm going to speak from notes and make remarks. The point I want to make is that we are severely off track, that we need an organized upheaval, and that it's going to be hard to implement, and it needs to be done systematically. And I'll give an example of globalism, excuse me, of globalism in order to illustrate the difficulty. So first point, severely off track, and let me go through some of the ways. In order to create peace through strength, you need hard power, soft power, and growth. We don't have any of those. We're on the eve of the NATO summit here in Washington. I shudder at the image of President Biden leading the United States in that summit and the Biden administration presenting to the world. We have weakness in both the hard power and the soft power. We just saw the Italy G7 summit. It was confused. I participated actively in the Hiroshima summit, which was a year ago, and want to read to you the White House rendition of what happened there. The White House says the G7 summit in Hiroshima showed that the G7 are more united than ever, united on Ukraine, China, economic security, building the clean energy economies of the future, nuclear disarmament, united on fighting poverty and responding to global challenges. So that was simply not true. The meeting was disjointed, and it was largely a photo op for people to be seen with leaders from the global south in an effort to compete with China. I also participated in the G7 summit in Schloss Imblo in Germany the previous year. So in 2022 in May, leaders met and for a whole day didn't talk about Ukraine. The war was on, and there simply was not a U.S. presence that was able to articulate on the problem facing the world from Ukraine. I had the privilege of participating in the finance ministers and central bank meetings along with the summits. And it's important because I'm sorry, there's noise over here. It's important because there is the facade of unity and of direction, but not really the reality of that. So as we think about how off track we are, one area is the debt. I have to say it matters. People often think in terms of the fiscal deficit and say, well, we can afford it. But the debt is harmful because it draws resources from the future generation to now. You only get to spend the $1 trillion or the $10 trillion that's being spent now. You get to spend it once, and children then will pay it back, but they won't get to spend it again. So we have to recognize the harm coming from that. We are facing a fiscal train wreck in 2025 because of the way the Biden administration has put off the problem. So the debt limit will come due. I had to sit with Secretary James Baker in the Reagan administration as he called Republicans and instructed them and pleaded with them to vote for the debt limit increase that was done. It's a harmful law. It needs to be fully rewritten to have strength, to actually restrain the size of government. There's a gap right now in our constitutional structure where the Constitution doesn't limit the size of the U.S. government, and we need to think about how to restrain it because, as you see every day, there's no restraint. The jobs numbers that just came, there's no restraint. The jobs numbers that came out last Friday showed that the biggest growth is government. It's going on and on and on and on and doesn't have limit. It crowds out the private sector, and so we need to think about, we heard this morning that we need to battle back to restore the constitutional order That's true, but I want to add to that, we also need to create a new constraint on size of government that's not right now in the way the government is operating. Very, very important. A related challenge and off-track nature is the depth of the swamp. I think people still don't have a full comprehension of how rich Washington, D.C. area is and why that's happening. So the swamp is deeply entrenched, it's getting rich, and there isn't really a path right now to stop that. I wrote in my Forbes columns in 2015 and 2016 about the median income, as it showed that Washington, Greater Washington, had both the greatest wealth and the greatest income of the country, and way, way above the average for the nation. So that's off track. Central banks are also off track. They are buying government bonds. So think about how harmful that is. You've got your central bank who is making the decision at its own choice with no appropriation, no constraint from the checks and balances of the system to buy the bonds issued by the government in the US, but also in Europe and heavily in Japan, which weakens the structure of the economies. The central banks, as the Federal Reserve has shown, had the power to lose $1 trillion. Think about how massive that power is. If I have the power to lose $1 trillion, I must be really powerful, and that's what's happened over the last 5 years as the Federal Reserve made bets into bonds that were the wrong bet. It's like the biggest, worst hedge fund bet ever on record. And so we need to think about also the inflation confusion that we're undergoing right now to see how far off track. My Wall Street Journal article a week ago or so was on the inflation problem and how the Fed's models didn't work, and the Biden administration kept switching from one explanation for another and never really allowing the true explanation, which was that government spending was simply too much, pumping up consumption. So we have to think about the extent of off track, and I could go on for a couple hours on more of this. But I won't. So let me see here. We need, then this brings us to what do we do about it? So we need to think in terms of a new course and upheaval. I wrote in 2016 5 of my Forbes columns specifically about how to do an upheaval and why it had to be thought of as an upheaval. I want to give you a little my background. So how did I get to that point of clarity in 2016? Like Yoram, I heard Yoram this morning, I was never a liberal nor a globalist. I grew up in a small iron-making town in northern Michigan, and it was in the Rust Belt. My first job was with a steel foundry making nuclear castings. So I recognized the importance of energy and how hard it was to get. I came to DC in 1983 in the heart of the Reagan Revolution. Remember, and it's important, the word revolution. He was changing things. It was an upheaval. So remember how he was doing that. He had put sanctions on Europe for becoming dependent on Soviet oil. He recognized early on. That didn't work. He tried, and it didn't work. The centrality of energy was very apparent at that time. Carter had gone into synthetic fuels. Remember syn fuels? It was a giant white elephant by the government. Huge spending that didn't work. So Reagan was cleaning it up. There was also restraint on Japan, which was important to me as a Michigander because of the auto sector. Japan started building cars in the US because of the voluntary restraint agreements that were put in. And it was the time also of CFIUS. I was involved in the original CFIUS that's the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, to screen the investment coming in. In those days, it was from Japan and from France. Very difficult takeover of US semiconductor industries and others that were stopped by Reagan. I joined the Treasury Department and the State Department in those years, and they were formative years for me because I saw leadership, and also I saw the growth of globalism going on strongly. I wrote column after column in the Wall Street Journal against the spread of globalism. One in 1989 was about the problem of the IMF, the austerity programs, and the Washington consensus. They simply weren't working, but they were being pushed by the Washington establishment on the world. In 1998, I did one to remove the IMF shackles from Asia. Remember the Asia crisis that was so deep in large part because of IMF programs. In 2002, I did one that got me in trouble because it was about Alan Greenspan at the height of his power, and he was not really understanding what was causing deflation and inflation. And the journal put his picture on it, not mine, but his, and that was a challenge. All through that period, globalism was expanding. The U.S. was pushing power to the United Nations, to the IMF. Obama came in and pushed power to the G20 in the Pittsburgh summit, and we've never looked back. The world is still building and building institutions. By the time I was Undersecretary of Treasury, my group at the Treasury Department, a relatively small group, was monitoring and having to go to and engaged in 100 international operations, organizations that were passing regulations and imposing global government. I expressed in the 2010s, I ran for Senate in New York State. So why did I do that? That was the Tea Party year. Remember, Obama was big in 2010, and Kristen Gillibrand had inherited her Senate seat from Hillary Clinton. And so I couldn't pass up that chance. The Republican elite was really helping the Democrats in that race. There probably wasn't much chance. I'm glad I did it. My favorite conversation during that time was with a truck driver who was running a live stream as he drove across the thruway in northern New York State, and he had a huge following within the core Tea Party people in New York that were supporting an upheaval, an actual change of direction for the country. I didn't win the election, but I'm glad I ran in it. The Republican Party is now blue collar. It was really a learning experience, I think, for the Republican Party, and it gave rise to Donald Trump. It also gave rise to my wonderful wife, Adele, who I see in the audience, and she became the chair. Yes. She's now president of the Daily Caller News Foundation, which generates a lot of content that is explanatory. But also, she was the chair of the Manhattan Republican Party as Donald Trump was beginning his run in 2016. So I volunteered for the campaign early. I worked with and kind of for Stephen Miller, who's going to follow me and is waiting for me to wrap up here. I wrote my Forbes columns on upheaval. I wrote the New York Times article in 2016 on why Trump's economic policies were much better than what Hillary Clinton was proposing. She was stuck because she had to support what Obama had done, which was disastrous. Growth was slow, projected growth was slow, and so it wasn't a workable campaign for her, and President Trump made hay of it. Really was able to explain that clearly. So I invite you to review those columns. One in 2016 that I'll read you from was from July of 2016, Trump using the public's anger So this was in Forbes, and I'll just read snippets. The anger is aimed at the bad results, and I list them. There's a sense that government won't change course no matter how badly it's doing. That sings to us today, right? They won't change course no matter how bad the results. High emotions are unsettling, but upheavals have to be emotional in order to succeed. Even the signers of the Declaration of Independence were blunt and loud, blaming the king emotionally. I invite and defend an emotional presidential campaign aimed at upheaval. Trump's fury, this is from 2016, but it probably applies now. Trump's fury at the status quo helps the election campaign build enthusiasm and a mandate for change. So I wanted to read that. You're here because you want out of the box of big government, rich Washington, D.C., the establishment. It's true of Brussels as well. And what we need is an organized upheaval. Chris DeMuth this morning said ideas and organization. So we need both of those. It's not just the talk, it has to be the action to actually get things done. So I think it's salvageable. I made a list of things that I think can help us salvage it. One is to undo bad regulation. Number two is fully remodel the Federal Reserve to defend the dollar, to encourage production. The Fed right now is trying to slow down the economy. That doesn't make sense. It only grew 1.4% in the first quarter, so why would you want to slow it down? What we need is more production in order to lower the inflation rate and lower interest rates. So we can get to lower interest rates, which would be good for everyone in the country, really, if we can get more production going. But that has to be allowed by the government. Right now, it's squashing the production. All of the models, I think, need to be redone, and the tools. And then a third thing, more effective military spending and deployment. Fourth is rewrite the debt limit, I mentioned that, so that it limits the size of government. We don't have any limit right now. And fifth, low tax rates on a broad base. All of these are tried and tested and worked for Reagan, and they worked in the first Trump administration. So this brings me to the third point. Implementation is so hard. And it's a giant challenge. Recognize what we're up against, an entrenched elite that really doesn't want to make the changes. Making them permanent is even harder. So you might be able to do them temporarily, but then they get washed away by the next administration, which is what Biden's been doing. So we need intensity, and we need leadership of big organizations. Recognize how gigantic the government is. There needs to be thick skin and damn the torpedoes. It's really important as people think about this. The shots will be coming at the change agents constantly, from a personal standpoint, from a professional standpoint. So action is key. We need a very strong White House. So I'll make a plea to the new White House that they have strength at the National Security Council, that's a linchpin, the National Economic Council, and OMB. They all sit very closely together. They have to be strong and well-staffed, and then guide the action that's going to come. We need to rebuild defense while breaking the military-industrial complex. Thank you. Similarly, we need to stop the climate industrial complex. One risk that we're running is the amount of money that's flowing in these areas is so much that it makes it very hard to stop them. Once the billions of dollars are flowing, how do you get Wall Street, how do you get corporate America to stop supporting ideas, even if they're not productive, they're not good ideas, but they're profitable for them, especially if the government is subsidizing them. So it's going to take a concerted effort to to extract us from those. We need to build energy. We need to think about the blue-collar workers and how manufacturing can be restored. I'm very proud to say my cousins are still running the iron works in East Jordan that I grew up in, and they're able to do it, but one of the big challenges is hiring skilled workers. They're constantly wanting to hire, but finding people that are ready to work and that are enabled in their skills. We have to recognize that the Federal Reserve is an agent of globalism, so it's going to be hard to you don't see it, but I saw it for 6 years, the spread of the U.S. power being distributed to the world, and particularly to China, through the global organizations that are really controlling many of the things in your life and my life. Okay, and so, the topic of my talk, which I haven't gotten to yet, Stephen, but I will, is how the U.S. recovers from globalism. And I gave you a hint at that. We have to recognize the depth of the off track, recognize that we have to implement, that we have to really seek an upheaval, a full rewrite of how we interact with the world through global organizations, and then have an intense implementation strategy that's driven by the White House through the departments in a coordinated fashion, which has not really happened before. And we have to recognize that it's a major threat. The world is mired in globalism now. It's the strength and the pervasive nature of the United Nations, of the World Health Organization, of the IMF, the World Bank, and on down. I did a list. I won't read it to you. It goes on to more than a page of the powerful international organizations that are guiding us. Some of the things that we have to watch out for within that effort, the central bank digital currencies, so that you can imagine the elite wanting to find a way to set that up. The preferred creditor treatment of the multilateral development banks. I won't get into it, but just recognize what China has been able to tap into, the strength of being a preferred creditor right alongside the World Bank in its institutions. That's the New Development Bank and the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. We have to watch out for global taxes. And I don't know if you saw yesterday France's election, one of the outcomes is the need for a wealth tax. They've been working with Brazil in the G20. Brazil is chairing the G20 this year. South Africa will chair it next year. So you can imagine the interest in the world of having taxation on global wealth, which has been formally proposed by both France and Brazil. And of course, the International Criminal Court. So I want to take one moment on that. Remember when the US senators wrote the letter to the criminal court and said that they should not be talking about Netanyahu, and the criminal court came back and said, you better watch out, you US senators, because you're violating the principles of the International Criminal Court. So the US and President Biden should have been standing up at that moment and saying, this is an outrage, that prosecutor needs to be removed, because this is way, way beyond the line. But my reaction to that is this is going on almost every day within the globalist movement, that things that we can look at as Americans and say that can't possibly be happening actually is happening in the meetings, and the results then show up in things like the Basel Accords on Banking, the Financial Stability Board, the DEI that's spread through the international organizations. So that really was the end of my talk. And so I want to summarize that we are in trouble. We're this great nation that's lost its way, that we have to recognize it's going to take an upheaval, not just changes on the margin in order to recover our greatness. And then 3, that the proof is in the pudding. It's actually making the changes in a way that they will last and become embedded within our structure. To do that, we have to have intensity, leadership, and size. There has to be an organizational structure, as Chris was talking about, that's powerful enough really to stand up to globalism. Thanks very much.